OI, a new immortality and the metaverse. Hi everyone, Tony here for Immortality. I first heard of space funerals on the early internet, along with buying land on the moon. A company will launch your corpse into the cosmos for a cost. I mean, what a great way to go. Even if they secretly cremated the body and told everybody they launched it towards the Orion star cluster or a black hole, having everyone believe such would have been worth it all the same. But darn it, we are immortalists, and space funerals are not immortality. Instead, we got Alcor and cryopreservation. Alcor will freeze or better vitrify your body until a later time, when science has the technology to de-vitrify and repair whatever went wrong, including curing aging. I hear they will now vitrify a head only for a substantial saving. I guess a new body is a technology of the future, and your brain would be transplanted back into a brainless clone built from your own DNA. Many people think about Alcor and its service. Many people have signed up and continue to sign up, according to popular belief, Walt Disney and many others who want their chance at immortality if it is ever possible. But recently, a new prospect has arisen, a new way to biological immortality. OI, organoid intelligence. Now, this one's going to be long-winded, futuristic sci-fi.
These little white blobs are clumps of brain cells that have been grown in a lab. Researchers connected one of them to a computer. Under the microscope, you can see the tiny wires that send electrical impulses in and out. It learned to play a 1970s video game called Pong in the rectangle on the screen. The lab-grown brain moves the white line to try and stop the dot getting past.
Right now, we have the chance for drug discovery, disease modeling, and understanding intelligence. The next stage could open up options such as cybersecurity management or more autonomous devices. And finally, perhaps we could even lead to sentient and fully autonomous robots that can act and change in the real world.
Mini brains are also being grown in a UK lab in order to study brain development. It's taken researchers 6 weeks to grow these mini brains. You can see the electrical activity of their neurons on this screen here. It's precisely because they behave similarly to human brains, even though it's at a very rudimentary level, that researchers here are taking great care in the way they develop the technology.
There may be the potential, probably much further down the line, to simulate something like certainly intelligence and cognition. We want to make sure that we know ahead of time where that boundary is so that we don't accidentally stumble over it.
The scientists are working with ethics experts.
Will these so-called mini-brains develop to the point where they can feel pleasure or pain? And how might we consider their moral status if they were conscious or sentient?
Today's mini-brains are a very long way off from becoming self-aware. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
Just so happens that the technology required for organoid intelligence requires the ability to maintain a real brain without a body. These organoids are living tissue, real neurons, and while these organoids are small at the moment, at some stage the size of these organoids increased, perhaps to the stage where they are bigger than a human brain. And at that stage, a human brain, by comparison, could also be kept alive without a body, using OI's own tech. Could OI be used to keep real human brains from dying bodies alive? Perhaps we can begin to venture into a complex and lengthy experiment into the possibility of saving brains in dying, sick and aging bodies using the field of organoid intelligence as a precursor.
My name is Brandy Schillace, and I wrote Mr. Humble and Dr. Butcher. One of Dr. White's favorite books was Frankenstein, and I think we can kind of understand why. One of his goals was to perform a head transplant. And he worked quite a lot on animal models, and that means he was doing experimentation, trying to isolate the brain, and that means removing it from its shell and seeing how it worked outside of an animal's body. He was so interested in this preservation of life that for him, bringing that brain into, a safe place made so much sense. And if your body was dying, but your brain was still alive and healthy, he really thought that you might be able to live longer if you could transplant another body to your head and brain, and then you might be able to live on. And so while that sounds really fringe and it sounds like science fiction, it's rooted in his belief that saving the life of the brain was of paramount importance. He says to himself, no one has managed to fully isolate a brain that's still alive. And what I mean by that is separate it from its body, have a brain by itself, alive and still thinking. He wanted to do that surgery on primates, rhesus macaques. He starts working on this in the 60s and 70s, and he basically manages to perfect a technique that keeps blood flowing to that animal, partly by slowing that animal down by hypercooling it, but also by using another monkey, a larger monkey, as a body blood donor. So he is essentially creating a monkey feeding blood to another monkey's brain, and ultimately as they peel away those outer layers, the bare bulb of its own, just the brain by itself. It's alive, but it's not inside a skull. And that's fascinating. It's never been done before. It's also pretty gruesome, because it can be really upsetting to read about those issues, particularly, I think, for primates, our nearest evolutionary relative. It's hard to read about someone slowly peeling away the outer covering of a naked brain. Once he had managed this, he had it hooked up to electrodes and he measured brain waves. And it turns out that brain waves were still being produced. That brain outside of a body was still consuming oxygen, was still living, and was still making brain waves. And that began to make him think, you can outlive your body. And that's a peculiar idea. That's science fiction.
Using OI like this provides a more natural and ethical progression where the technology would come about as a side effect. OI might just be a better way to pursue that kind of science. The sophistication of the system around the organoid would grow with the organoid in tandem with the size of the organoid, so that if the organoid ever got as big as a human brain, the system around that organoid would be highly sophisticated. Sophisticated enough that a human brain hooked up to that life support system would not be unethical or cruel.
Its mouth is moving, its tongue is moving. It responds to noise, it responds to touch. He proved that this head, this brain, can live outside of its body, still thinking, still having input, still having output, and that this is possible. Once White proved that this was possible, he naturally began to think about ways it might help human beings. And for many of us, that might be a step too far, and we think that's macabre. Now you're getting into that realm of science fiction. But he was interested in part because this was a man who dealt almost all the time with people in various stages of trauma. He worked for a trauma hospital. And he saw people fade and fail, even though they could have kept going. Their bodies failed them, but their brains had been sharp up to the end.
Now, we don't want to do anything unethical or cruel, right?
I got good news for you. You're going to have a chance for immortality. As long as nothing happens to that lovely brain.
This very idea was explored in a movie called RoboCop 2. The scene, Kane's brain.
Dr. Waldman? It's Vex. I'm afraid we lost our patient. Yeah, he just expired. Contact the organ harvest team. Make it fast. We got 6 minutes before the brain's useless.
Come on, let's move it. We've only got 5 minutes. Lock it up.
I've got things that
Okay. Creation temperature?
optimum.
Move the screen in a little closer. I can't read it.
How'd we get this one?
Well, Fax found him. He volunteered.
Volunteered. Big-hearted guy.
Yeah. It's not the heart we're after, though. There you go.
Speaking of hearts, how's Eileen?
Christ, does everybody know? Well, here we go. Easy.
We got it. Here it comes. Thing of beauty.
Excellent. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm hungry.
And there it is. You have the brain, you have the stem of the nervous system, you have the hookup, and you have the life support system. While Kane's brain was then planted in a robot to make RoboCop, it would be too much of a challenge to implant a brain into a robot. The likely application is to use OI's interface and interface the brain with a computer. Neurons are non-dividing cells and generally outlive the organism. They are probably immortal out of the box, as one study shows that the neurons have no internal aging mechanism, but are subject to the environment they are in. While immortal, they are not invulnerable. There are a handful of corporations that could steer such a technology. It incorporates many fields and many products. Intermediate products towards this end are the multitude of sensory prostheses that function by electrical signals from silicon into the nerve endings, such as cochlear implants, retinal and optical nerve implants, and many more. These intermediate products, such as prostheses and biological life support systems, are medical products with mature markets. These form an intermediate market for the technology. This is a complex project. So, will OI lead to jar brain in the multiverse? Will it get funded? Tony, over and out.